Thank you guys for being here today and joining us. Sewell mentioned this is going to be a panel on the public education and the legislative session. Before I get started, this session is supported by Raise Your Hand Texas, Texas 2036, Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute, Texas State Technical College, Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, and the Texas Association of Community College. And we'll go ahead and introduce our panelists today. Today we have State Rep Harold Dutton, the chairman of the House Public Education Committee. Dutton, a native of Fifth Ward, Texas, and a lifelong Democrat, his roots began in Kelly Courts. After graduating from Phyllis Wheatley High School when he was only 16 years old, Dutton attended Texas Southern University, where he earned a BBA in accounting. Dutton's academic and professional achievements resulted in his designation as a distinguished alumnus by the TCU School of Business. Representative Dutton is also a graduate of the Thurgood Marshall Law School of Law, where he was inducted into the Who's Who in American colleges and universities. In the 87th legislative session, Dutton was named the chairman of the House of the Public Education Committee, the first African-American member of the Texas House in Texas history to be designated. Dutton's many legislative achievements include successful sponsorships of Texas's first statutory program to assist women and minority-owned businesses, initiatives to enhance public education, particularly in alternative education, and creation of incentives to the problems of insurance availability and affordability in traditionally underserved areas. Other legislative achievements include legislation for Texas' annual sales tax holiday, and legislation permitting ex-offenders to gain the right to vote, and providing compensation for wrongly convicted individuals. And then we have State Rep Gary VanDeaver. During the 87th legislature, Dr. Gary VanDeaver served his fourth term as a state representative of Texas House District 1, that then included Bowie, Lamar, and Franklin and Red River counties. The redistricting of legislative districts in 2021 changed House District 1 to include Bowie, Cass, Lamar, Morris, and Red River counties. House Speaker Dade Phelan appointed Rep VanDeaver to continue serving on the House Committee of Appropriations and the House Committee of Public Education, which he has served since his first term in 2015. Last fall, Speaker Phelan appointed him also to serve on the Texas Commission of Community Colleges, funding to make recommendations to the 88th legislature that convenes next month. While in the legislature, Representative VanDeaver has helped draft responsible state budgets that held overall state spending below the rate of inflation and population growth. Over the years, VanDeaver has passed legislation specifically for interest in House District 1, including bills related to the election of trustees for the Paris Junior College, appointment of bailiffs in Bowie County Courts, additional powers for the Tex America Center, and numerous public education bills. He also spent 33 years of public education, most recently serving as superintendent of the New Boston Independent School District before his initial election to the Texas House in 2014. So with that, we'll talk till about 1:45, and then we'll open up to questions. So with that, let's get started into the issues heading into next session concerning public education. So the first thing I want to talk about is school safety. It's in top of mind for many parents, children, educators, and I'm sure legislatures and lawmakers heading into this school year. As we all know, we are about 7 months after the deadliest shooting in Texas, where 19 children, 2 teachers died in Uvalde at Robb Elementary. With more than 1,000 school districts with multiple campuses and multiple bills already filed, mostly on addressing safety and mental health, what does a successful school safety bill priorities look like next session?
Well, let me start and by saying thank you for inviting me to this, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to serve with my colleague, Representative VanDeaver. Let me start by saying school safety, the safest place on the planet for a student ought to be at school. No parent should ever worry about their child coming home from school. And having said that, though, we recognize that during the time when the shooting happened in Uvalde, oddly enough, our public education committee was meeting that day, and we were meeting, and I was conducting the meeting as chairman, and I got a text that said somebody had been slain in Uvalde, but I didn't know, they didn't say why. Eventually, I got another text saying, wait a minute, what had happened was there had been several students killed and a couple of teachers killed. But oddly enough, at the same time, we were hearing in our committee, we were hearing one of the charges, interim charges that the speaker had given us to do, and it was about the mental health in schools. And that's what we were doing at the time. We were hearing comments from the invited testimony and members of the committee on what we should do about mental health to improve school safety. I still think that is, by and large, one of the areas in which we have to do a better job, both for students in school and out of school, so that we can somehow or another get to the point where all students are safe at school. The problem that we have run into as a committee is, and this happens more often than not, our committee hears of a problem, and then we as the committee will start designing a solution to that problem, and in many cases what we design is a solution that is a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. And we sometimes don't recognize that one-size-fits-all is not the answer to the problem on the first part, and the second place is it usually doesn't fit anybody. And so what we've tried to do in terms of school safety is leave it as much as we could at a local level to make the decisions about what they particularly need to improve the safety of their schools. We do have a Safe Schools Committee that what they do is try to go and make sure that there are certain things done to improve the safety having to do with access to the campus and those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to us. One of the things we heard during the interim was that sometimes teachers, for example, don't know who to go to if they perceive that there is a problem with a student. Sometimes teachers that we've heard from say they talk about it, but they just wasn't aware of who they needed to go talk to about a student. And I'll just give you one quick example. I went to a school, and as I toured the school, I came down to a room that was the teacher told me that was an ISS room. And I said, well, I want to go in there and I want to see. Well, we went to the door was locked, and they opened it, and this big guy came out and stood in the middle of the doorway, and the teacher said, well, this is Representative Dutton. He wants to see what's happening in here. And he finally moved and let us in. So I went to talk to the students who were sitting around a desk, a wall desk, and the first one was a young lady who, and I went to her and I asked her, why was she there? Because the teacher told me that this is the last place they send you before they call the police on you or put you out of school. And the young lady said, well, she had had a fight. The teacher standing next to me said, no, tell Mr. Dutton the truth. You always have fights. And so I told the young lady, I said, look, as a lawyer, I am a good friend of Don King's, and I represent lots of boxers. And if you want to learn to box, maybe I could sign you up and we could both get paid. And so she said, no, I don't want to do that. And I said, well, tell me why you have fights. And she said, why are you getting in my Kool-Aid? I said, well, look, I came to help. I just want to know the answer. She said, well, the kids pick on me. And I said, well, why do you think they pick on you? And she said, well, you sure are getting in my mix. I said, well, look, I just want to know. And she said, well, sometimes I have to wear the same clothes to school every day. And I asked, you have to wear the same clothes to school? She said, yeah, let me tell you this, sir. My dad died, my mom is in prison, and I live with my aunt. And sometimes when I come home from school, my aunt is not there, and I have to stay on the front porch all night. I looked at the teacher and I said, did somebody recognize that this student has a problem? She said, well, I don't know. I said, well, somebody should have recognized. If a child shows up at the school every day with the same clothes on, you have to recognize that something is going on in a child's life, and somebody ought to be adult enough to at least ask a question. Well, we found out what was going on. She said she didn't have a key. Her aunt didn't give her a key, but she still came to school. And so to me, that was quite impressive. And we got involved in that child's life, and we got as much as we could, we got it turned around. But my point in bringing that up is that teachers, and I know we ask a lot of teachers. We ask probably too much of teachers. In fact, this morning we were on a panel, Representative VanDeaver and I said to them that the education codes had some 900 pages in it. And I'm not sure, I've read them all, but I'm not sure they all need to be there, because it seems to me that what we ought to do is leave it up to teachers to teach, and so that they can identify if a student has a problem, then they refer that student someplace so they get the problem addressed. On the other hand, I still think the climate in this state and in this country is one that somehow or another has said to people that the way to solve a problem is with a gun. And we need to stop that. We need to change that. We need to at least be able to see that adding more guns to a situation where there are guns is not a solution, but that creates more of a problem. And I'm sorry for taking so long, but.
Yeah, I agree with Chairman, and we know that if we can't ensure the parents and the students, at least to some degree, that they are safe, it's really difficult for learning to take place. I think research certainly shows that if you are worried about your safety, you really are not open to learning. And so we have to do whatever we can to create safe environments, and I think we're working on that. The problem is, again, as Chairman Dutton said, it is absolutely not a one-size-fits-all. As a former superintendent, the school from which I graduated, from which I retired, I felt like I graduated when I left. The high school alone covered about 4 or 5 city blocks with streets running between them. Ag building was down the street over here. The stadium was over here, and field house and band hall. And to try to secure that was just almost impossible. And so and some of the newer facilities that are being built today are not that way. They're designed with safety in mind, but the reality is we're still occupying a lot of buildings in this state that were built 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and safety was not really, one of the primary concerns at that time. Safety was, but trying to combat the things we're dealing with today was not. So say all that to say, we know that, we have a tendency in the legislature, if there's a problem, we throw money at it and hope someone fixes it. And that's probably what's going to happen to some extent. And it needs to. Fixes to these issues are expensive. I have schools that are trying to repair all their doors, make sure all their doors lock, and put in alarm systems, put in monitoring systems, and everything that it takes to try to make a building safe. That's very expensive in today's world, and so it's going to take funding. My hope is that we will fund and basically through a safety allotment, if you will, and leave the the details to the local district to decide how to spend that money and how best to use the funding to be able to secure their buildings and ensure student safety. One thing that I think we should note, a lot of the hardening of the buildings that we see going on right now and implementation of different programs, and it's all over the place, and a lot of really good things out there. But most of the schools that I've talked to are funding it with COVID relief funds, which will, by the way, go away very soon. So I think we as a legislature need to be cognizant of that. We need to be prepared to come in when those funds stop or before, and make sure that there's not a gap so that we can fund school safety on an ongoing basis. It's not going away. We recognize that. The need is not going away, and so we need to be prepared to continue to address it, because again, that should be, it's unfortunate that it's this way, but that should be our primary goal in anything we do in public education, is to first ensure their safety and then ensure student outcomes. So.
I want to pivot into something else, which, schools have been dealing with a lot the last, after the pandemic hit, before the pandemic hit, but the pandemic kind of seemed to exacerbated the teacher shortages of counselors. I know some schools are trying their best to fill in gaps here and there. I'm hearing some classrooms are too big. Their sub-teachers are having, more students. So what does this kind of look like in this session with funding to give either teachers more money or schools more resources? Especially, and trying to get not only keep the teachers that are there, but create some sort of pipeline to keep a revolving kind of steady stream of people that want to go into the profession.
Well, I appreciate the question. The answer is that teacher shortages are being experienced all over the country. It's not just here in Texas. But one of the things we heard during our interim hearing was that there are two ways in which we get teachers in the state of Texas. One is going through the traditional schools and universities, and the other one is an alternative certification method. And when the person testifying to us indicated that the percentage of teachers leaving the profession were disproportionately alternatively certified. And what that said to me was, what I started asking questions about, though, was whether or not those particular people had really teaching in mind as a first alternative, but chose to do that until their first alternative showed up somehow or another. And when they took the alternative certification route, they went to teach, but then when that first alternative showed up, they decided not to teach. And so that raised a question in my mind as to how we should deal with that. But at the same time, I also recognize that the teaching profession is dominated 75% female. And I don't think you'd find anybody in this audience anywhere that would disagree that the discriminatory pay scale for females has been in existence for a long time, not only just in this state, but in this nation. And so if you want to turn around that whole problem of teachers coming into the profession and leaving, and one of the things we ought to do is get the pay scale up to a point where, for example, a chemistry major who decides, well, do I decide to go teach or do I decide to go to work for Exxon? Well, I think most of us know the answer to that. We'd go to work for Exxon because the pay is going to be significantly different. But that ought not to be the case. We ought to fix it so that a teacher, a person who goes into teaching, doesn't have to worry about whether or not they're going to have to get a second job to maintain a household, to whether or not they're going to do anything in terms of trying to provide for a family. But at the same time, I recognize that males aren't going to be drawn to that profession because of the pay. And somehow or another, we've got to improve the pay, and that will increase the access to teaching on the parts of males. Now, I don't mean for anybody to think that I mean, most of my teachers were females, and I just loved them. I mean, most of us couldn't be here without great teachers, and most of the great teachers I had were females. But it's the same thing is true for teaching as it is. I spoke to a nursing organization, and what they were trying to do is to design a method by which they could attract more males to the nursing profession. And I told them they were going to have a hard time doing that because I can remember, and probably you all do too, whenever I got hurt, I ran right past my dad to my mom because I didn't want him to have to deal with it. I wanted her to deal with it. But at the same time, when we start to resolve this problem of teaching, and in terms of pay, and in terms of what we're requiring teachers to do, we have to be respective of the fact that the legislature can't keep putting things on teachers to do other than teach. When we start requiring teachers to do things that go beyond teaching, we've actually invaded and caused many teachers to decide to leave the profession simply because of that. So anyway, one of the things we got to deal with is that teaching, the loss of teachers or the disproportionate numbers of teachers that are not, that are leaving the professions, or somehow or another disproportionately in schools made up of children of one particular race or another. And most commonly, it is the students of color whose schools have been absent a lot of number of teachers who decide to leave the profession. And so we've got to address all those things. But all those are basically part and parcel of this whole question of teachers and pay and teachers leaving the profession.
Yeah, I agree, and I want to kind of expound on some of that as well. You know, we all recognize, I think, I hope, that teacher salaries are not where they need to be. We know that we need to continue, and by the way, we have made some great strides over the past couple of sessions, I think, to increase teacher pay, but it is not as competitive as it should be, and again, we should be drawing those chemists from Exxon and enticing them to go into teaching. But I don't believe that pay alone is going to be the answer to the problem, because, as Chairman alluded to, that the working conditions are probably equally responsible for good teachers leaving the field. They're worn out, especially after COVID. We're asking a lot of them. Longer hours. Classroom management is an issue. A lot of teachers who leave are fed up with the lack of authority in the classroom. Truancy is an issue that we have to look at and try to address to get those students in school more often. Teachers are frustrated because a child will be in their room on Monday and then miss 3 or 4 days and come back, and it's just not a good learning environment. I will also say a couple of other things. One is talking about the pipeline coming in, the university or alternative cert, whichever direction someone takes. We have to, I think, find a way to I think the student teaching, the practicum, I think is very important. I think that's maybe the difference between the university method and the alternative cert method in a lot of cases. The time in the classroom under a mentor teacher is very important. The problem is there are very few people today who can afford to go unpaid for 3 or 4 months while they do their student teaching. And so I think it would be wise of us to find a way to have those teachers, those future teachers, earn a salary while going through the practicum. The other thing I'll say is, we know the pipeline is not adequate. Universities tell us, their enrollment in the education field is down considerably. And so we know we need to fill that pipeline. But the problem is, if we fill the pipeline today, we're still probably 4 to 5 years away from seeing that in our classrooms. And so we're going to have a gap that I think we have to address. We can't ignore this gap, even if we could fill the pipeline today. And I believe the best way to fill that gap is going to be with retired educators. We have to, I think, tear down barriers to retirees coming back into the classroom. I think we have created a situation with the extended layout period, the surcharge that's required. We've built these barriers, and I get why. We want to protect the retirement system, but we need those people back in the classroom. And so we have to break those barriers that would allow them to come back in the classroom. You think about it, those people are already trained, they're experienced, and they have what I consider to be the real magic solution. They have the calling. And I truly believe that teaching is a calling, and those people have it, and we need them today more than ever. We need them back in that classroom.
And I think, coming out of this kind of pandemic period for schools, teachers leaving because of it, fights over masks, vaccines, books, and things like that, has kind of given a resurgence, I guess, of school choice being a priority for some legislators this spring. There's been a couple already filed, or bills filed. What does the school choice voucher system work in Texas? We know how Republicans are kind of split on this. What does that look like this session, and what are you guys' thoughts on just this whole kind of fight over kind of parent empowerment?
Well, school choice and the whole voucher question has come up in the legislature before. It's come up at least 3 or 4 times since I've been in the legislature. And every time I think it's been defeated. The last time I think was last session. We had the voucher bill to kind of get to the floor, and there were more than 100 votes against it. I don't see much in the way of, other than it's now more vocal. But the question becomes, when you talk about school choice, is it a choice between a real choice? Is it a real choice between a good school and a bad school? I mean, I think of it this way. I said to somebody that if all the schools were basically doing what I think they should do, which is unlock the genius in every child who shows up at the front door, then I might be considering that, because then it would be a real choice. It would be a choice between a great school and a great school. But I'm not sure that's what most of the people are aimed at now. Not only that, I think you have to ask yourself the question, what is the problem that you're trying to cure with school choice? If it's, and people have told me that, to my face, that, well, Representative Dutton, we think that parents who have their kids locked in a low-performing school ought to have some way out. I said, well, they do now. And they said, what? I said, why don't we go fix the dang school? Why don't we just fix the school? Because the reality is that, and I've talked to the private schools also, the private schools don't want vouchers. They don't want that to be in effect in Texas. They would rather not have that because they recognize that they don't invite the state into their whole business, into their schools. And I recognize that, but I also will acknowledge that for many of us, the school board elections come around, and sometimes people get elected to the school board with less than 5% of the vote taking place. Think about that, less than 5% of the vote taking place in an area, and yet that's who gets elected to school boards. Somehow or another, we need to change all that paradigm so that at least we get like my friend says, if you don't vote, you get the kind of government you need, that you don't want. And I think that's true, particularly when it comes to school board elections, that we ought to do something that improves the outcome for children in these schools. And I said this morning too, two things that ought to dominate this session. That's we ought to increase student outcomes, and we ought to increase teachers' incomes so that you don't have continuing this idea that somehow or another vouchers are going to be the answer to what's happening in public schools. To me, in my way of thinking, what it would do simply is take more money away from public schools, so you'd have less now resources to fix the problem that exist in public schools. The real concern for all of you all ought to be this, that to the extent that a voucher program is implemented in Texas, and it takes some students out of campuses into other campuses, into private school campuses. Think about this. Your children are still going to end up intermingling with those children from that other school anyway. And when that happens, you're going to hope that they have a book bag and not something else. And so what we can all do is we all got to do a better job of fixing our public schools. And having said that, let me tell you one of the crises that we're facing in this state. If you go look at the third grade reading scores for all of Texas, you'll find that we have an impending crisis on our hands because children are not reading on grade level, who are not reading on grade level by third grade. As I'm fond of saying, that's when they drop out of school. They leave in ninth grade, but they dropped out in third grade because what happens is you have to, between pre-K and third grade, you learn to read. After third grade, you read to learn. And if you never get that first part done, you simply never get to the point where you read to learn. And as a consequence, what happens is you finally roll along until ninth grade and then you leave, then you go away. And so that's why I was never fond of dropout programs that are targeted at ninth grade. We ought to target those at third grade. We ought to make sure that every child who leaves third grade can read. And let me say this finally. I took a look at what other states are doing with this. And some states are doing nothing, but some states are doing quite well at it. The state of Mississippi, for example, they have a law in Mississippi now that says if you have 4 chances to move from third grade, but you have to prove that you can read. And I'm not sure Texas is ready for that because we don't necessarily do things to make sure that every child has the same resources so that they can learn to read. But we ought to do that, and we have to do that. And as I said to the governor, it is important for us because in 10 years, 12 years, those children who can't read are going to show up as the statistics in our employment, as just in our social, they're going to be so in our social service systems because they won't be able to maintain the jobs in Texas at that time. And so we ought to do something now. We don't have tomorrow to do it, but we ought to do it today because those children who can't read in third grade, as I said before, they're the canary in the mine shaft for us. that says, look, this is what Texas is going to look like if we don't do something. Right now to this day, between the ages of 18 and 25, we have almost 5 million people who don't have a high school diploma. Think about that. Almost 5 million people who don't have a high school diploma in the state of Texas. We can't go on like that. And the truth is that the student population is becoming one more of color. And we need to pay attention to that so that we can now make sure that every child, as I said before, every child who shows up at the front door of the school, we unlock the genius in that child. I used to think, and I know you all have seen it too, as you drive around, particularly the inner cities, you see just hordes and hordes of men standing on the corner who are doing nothing and going no place. And I used to wonder, Representative VanDeaver, why don't they go get a job or something? And perhaps you've done that too, except I started now rethinking that whole thing. Since I know that God doesn't invent junk, we have to invent our own junk. And so, since God didn't invent junk, I wonder what he placed in one of those persons who are standing out there. I wonder what he placed in them that we don't get the benefit of simply because we didn't educate them. And the truth is that most of them, like I said before, they dropped out in 3rd grade when they couldn't read. And yet we moved them through the system, and somehow or another they left at 9th grade, and that's how they end up out there on the side of the road. So anyway, that's I'm probably going over beyond the question. But again, public education to me, I wouldn't be here, and perhaps you wouldn't either, without public education. And so I just know that the time is right for us to do things, and vouchers simply divert us from doing the things we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, what can I add? I think Chairman pretty well covered it, and I agree. We face some serious challenges today in public education, and I don't think any of us want to pretend that those challenges are not there. We have to recognize the challenges we have, and we have some schools who are not that are not performing. And we need to give them the resources they need and the direction they need to be able to turn those schools around. And I think that's what we have tried to do. I get the sense, and maybe this is not accurate, but I get the sense, things start going the way you don't agree with at the federal level, and you hear people saying, well, we should secede. Things are going the way you maybe don't agree with at the public school, and people say, well, we should just leave our public schools. I'm thankful that our forefathers didn't quit. As Texans, we face challenges, and we conquer challenges, and these challenges are no greater than the challenges that the people who came before us face, and we are benefiting from them standing strong, facing those challenges, and solving those problems. We owe it to the next generation to do the same. And we don't do that by abandoning our public schools and the children who are in them. We have to provide them the resources. And a voucher program would take money. I know there are those who say this is not the case, but if there is money to go to a voucher, then that money should be going to a public school, and we have school choice. Again, we have to be careful that we don't confuse choice and voucher. They're not the same. We have school choice in Texas. Students in my district, in my house district, can choose among several schools if they want to go to a neighboring school. There are schools that will allow a child to transfer between campuses. And so, we create in our minds these huge problems and then feel that the solution is to leave and to abandon it. And I have to think that sometimes, that's the ultimate goal anyway, is to do that. So, and I'll say this, and I'll probably get in trouble for this. My staff's here on the front row. They're probably going to throw a bottle of water at me when I when I say this. But I was raised in rural Texas. I'm not real complicated, okay? I'm fairly simple, the way I see things, and I was raised to believe that where there's smoke, there's fire, and I was taught that all my life, pretty much. That if there's smoke, there's fire, and I believe that. But over the last 8 years, I've come to realize that sometimes where there's smoke, there's a smoke machine. Okay? And so I think it's important that we as legislators do our due diligence and determine if there's truly a fire there or if it's just a machine. And I fear that sometimes the things that make the headlines are just that. It's just smoke.
Amen.
Real quick, I want to leave time for questions. I know this is a big issue, but talking about student outcomes, in last session, 2021, get my years wrong now, but there was things like, the two things that come to my head was like House Bill 4545, which was required tutoring for kids that failed sections of the STAR to kind of be able to catch them up from that interrupted learning. There were things like reading academies, and both of those things, I don't know what you guys have heard from teachers and school districts, but teachers and superintendents have told me it's been hard trying to meet those requirements of HB 45. There's a lack of people that want to tutor, and then with reading academies, teachers had to do that at home. They would have to take that during the weekends because they had a bunch of other things to do. So what does, student outcomes in terms of recovering from this interrupted learning look like in this next session, and as quickly as possible?
Yeah, right. Well, as the House sponsor of House Bill 4545, I will tell you that we put it together because we recognized that students needed to do something, because what has happened is we always had some students dominating the bottom educationally. And what the pandemic did is it shoved a whole bunch of students to the bottom. And so now we had to address, what do we do about these students on the bottom? The legislature and House Public Education Committee, we've always tried to improve education by raising the ceiling. We had never before tried to raise the floor. In fact, we had a discussion at one time on the committee, about graduation requirements and whether we ought to institute a condition that you had to pass Algebra 1 to graduate from high school. And I said, well, wait just a minute. Before we do that, we have a number of students who can't pass general math. And so what we're going to do is put education and graduation further out of reach for them. And so we needed to do something to help them. Well, the pandemic shoved so many other students into that category that now we were trying to do something to help them. And that was the beginning of House Bill 4545, because we were trying to figure out how are we going to address this learning deficit that's been created by the pandemic, but has been there all along. We simply had never done much to help it. But I realized, and I've heard from school districts, and I've listened to teachers, and I've listened to school superintendents about the problems that we've had with House Bill 45. And I can tell you we'll be making some changes to it come this session so that it will be less onerous on teachers, but at the same time trying to be the vehicle by which we improve student outcomes. Because that, in as much as anything, is what we have to do and what we ought to say we did at the end of the session for my committee and the whole legislature is, did we do enough to improve student outcomes? Because if we don't, like I said before, we're going to be in a difficult situation here in Texas if we don't do that. Now, the reading academies, again, I've explained to you about reading in Texas. We just have to do something that's going to make a difference in outcomes. It's interesting that we started this whole House Bill 4545, and one of the things we had in it at first was we were going to give school districts a certain amount of money for each student in outcomes of students as they progressed based on how they were doing on how they recovered from the standardized testing. Well, what I heard from school districts kind of shocked me a little bit because they said they didn't like this idea of student outcomes. I said, yes, you do. They said, no, we don't like student outcomes. We don't like funding based on student outcomes. I said, yes, you do. They said, no, we don't. I said, well, let me explain it to this way. Why don't you give us the money back that we paid you to educate kids who didn't get educated? And then we'll see. I said, you don't do that, so you must like student outcomes. I heard also from colleges and universities who are having to do remedial courses for incoming freshmen who can't meet the standards at that university because the children haven't been sufficiently and adequately educated so that they can begin freshman years. Now, the only people who that dings are the student and the university. Where they came from, the school district they came from, they don't have to engage in that. And the other thing that struck me as strange is that when I looked at many of the school superintendent contracts, guess what it had in it? Funding for student outcomes. And I thought, well, wait a minute now, that's something wrong with that. But anyway, we're going to improve House Bill 4545, and we're going to try to do something that changes the paradigm for children who are at the bottom. Because one of the things we recognize is that for a child who is behind, and this is the data that comes from the TEA, from Commissioner Morath, he says that in 4 years, only 7% of those kids have caught up. So anyway.
Yeah. Representative, as quickly as you can, so we get to questions.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, 4545, I think, was a great piece of legislation, and it was intended to do just what Chairman Dutton has just laid out. And I think where we ran into problems, again, as you mentioned earlier, we try to do a one-size-fits-all, and sometimes it doesn't fit, and I think for a lot of school districts, the way we have 4545 designed at this point, it doesn't fit. And so I look forward to working with Chairman this session to make some changes to it, and make it so that it accomplishes what we intend to accomplish with providing the extra tutoring, the extra help for these students, but yet it's not so onerous on the teachers and on the school district itself. It's kind of an indictment of us, I think. I had a teacher tell me, with 4545, I can't afford to teach. And I said, what do you mean by that? She said, well, with 4545, I'm having to spend so much time on my job that I can't work my second job. Now that's an indictment on us that the teacher, number one, had to have a second job to be able to make a living in addition to the teaching job, and now we have burdened them to the point that they can't keep that second job. So there's definitely work to be done there, and again, this also folds into teacher retainment and teacher recruitment and just the work environment for teachers. So yeah.
We'll move to questions now if you want to start over here.
For both the members, appreciate your work. The accountability system in Texas today says that about 70+% of our schools, our campuses, are getting an A or a B. Yet at the same time, we all know that academic performance is based on the NAEP, et cetera, fell off the cliff for a good reason, understandably so. COVID was disastrous to academic achievement. So why is it that the accountability system says everything is hunky-dory, at the same time the reality is far different from that? And wouldn't it be better public policy to be honest about where we are for a lot of different reasons, but also in terms of needed funding for the schools?
Well, let me answer it this way. The accountability system, I look sort of at like when you go to the doctor. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you know, your blood pressure is 138 over 72, that sounds real good. But that doesn't mean you're well. That just means your blood pressure isn't high and raised. And you get further checking, and you can find out some other things are wrong. The STAR system and the system we have for accountability, the STAR testing rather, and we've tried to divide it up so that somehow or another we take a look at progress in terms of how campuses are doing, how districts are doing in terms of progress. We take a look at student achievement on the test. And so I don't want us to be lulled to sleep, though, by the fact that I think the point he's raising is that the accountability system seems to suggest that we're doing great. And I think for what it's trying to measure, we are doing great. It's one of the things I have said is a problem because, for example, we take a look at the third grade reading scores and we recognize that less than 30% of our children are on reading grade level. But when you look at graduation rates, we say 90% of our kids are graduating. And you go, well, wait a minute, those seem to be inconsistent at some point. And so I think you've got to be just completely aware and conscious of the fact that this is one measurement that tells you something, but it doesn't say anything about how the whole patient is.
You know, we struggle, I think, statewide, nationwide maybe, with coming up with a way to really measure success. What does success look like in a school? Well, I think most of us would agree success is when students leave there with an education that, you know, with the skills they need to either go to a higher education institute or go to work and make a living wage. But that is extremely hard to measure. And I'm not a fan of the STAR test, and partly because of what you've just described. I don't think the STAR test really measures what we are hoping to measure. So, you know, I think the accountability system is, we continue to tinker with it, and I don't know that we have hit the solution yet on our accountability system. But the chairman's right. I mean, we can't be lulled by good scores at a school into thinking that everything is perfect with that school, because it's not. And I think we've seen an uptick too because of the CCMR portion of the accountability system. You know, schools were able to get credit for some college career military readiness that maybe they hadn't in the past, and that kind of skewed the scores a little bit. And so it's a constant battle. And I'll be the first to tell you, we have not found the accountability system at this point that truly measures and reports the success or failure of the school.
Go over here.
My question is about teachable children. I learned that as a teacher for 26 years, there was the affective side of learning, and then there was the academic side of learning. And in 2011, when the legislature cut $5.4 billion out of the education budget, in my school district, Humble ISD, all of the support staff, social workers were cut so that the district could continue to operate. That was pre-COVID. Today, children are walking into the classroom, and your very first illustration, Mr. Chairman, is exactly the kind of illustration where we need a child we can teach. Texas teachers, all 300,000 of us, are ready. but we need a kid we can teach. Some need glasses, some need a safe place to stay, some need breakfast and don't know how to ask. What can the legislature do to help us now in 2023 get more teachable children inside Texas classrooms?
Well, that's a difficult question, because I think you're going to still get the same students showing up at the front door. What we got to do is figure out how inside of that school we create the right resources so that we maximize our ability to change that child to where that child gets an education, despite all the other things. When I grew up in Houston, in what was called the Fifth Ward, what's still called Fifth Ward, Texas. I will tell you, sometimes we used to say we learned more on the way to school than we did in school. And that's still true. But when I look at things like, for example, third grade reading scores, which I talked about a little bit, one of the things I recognized, and looking at other states, is that other states had a criteria where they had had a word list that third graders ought to know. Texas doesn't have that. We don't have that. And I asked one of my educated friends about that, and she said, well, Harold, you got to recognize some kids don't even have a book at home. They don't have books at home. They don't read books at home. That their word vocabulary is very limited in terms of the words they know. I think we've got to do something to help that situation. And some of it may be that we don't have the teacher be the person to have to always be that person doing it. I learned to speak and to talk at church, quite frankly. We read things at church, and you had to get up sometimes and speak at church. And so there are things that when we all recognize that it takes a village to raise a child, we sometimes don't recognize that when that child doesn't turn out the way we want, something was wrong with the village. And sometimes that something that's wrong in the village is not the school and not the teacher. It's the other parts of the community that need to step up and help that child, in some cases help that family, deal with things that sometimes cause children not to learn. And so I realize the question you're asking me is what the legislature can do about that. We can do certain things, but I think the answer comes more generally from things outside the legislature.
Yeah, just real quickly, I agree that we can't. I don't think the legislature can fix that problem. We can chip away at it, and there are things that we know we need to do that we have not had the will to do, and so I'll say that up front. And I also want to point out that this is not a problem that's unique to urban inner city schools. I spent my career in the largest school I was in had a total population of students of 1,500, and the other two were smaller than that. So small schools. And as a principal, I would, more often than I would like to admit, I would have to leave once we checked roll and realized who was not there. I would take a school vehicle around and get those children out of bed, and bring them to school. And again, mom and dad may be at work, whatever the situation, and so fortunately we were small enough that we could respond to those students, and we got them to school. And mom and dad gave us permission, yeah, go get them, please go get them, we can't we can't get them to get out of bed. And so, but it does take the whole community, I think. And we've seen some really good outcomes here in the Austin area with their communities and schools program that just kind of wrap the community around the school and provide those services. And I think that model works well. We haven't been able to really replicate that across the state, but I think that model works very well. The community we have to understand that we all benefit when that child is in school, and it's upon us to make sure that child is in school and has those needs met, whether it's hunger, whether it's glasses, whether it's mental health, whatever those issues are. We have to get past this. It's not the child's fault. We can't punish the child just because the parents, or because whoever, is not stepping up and doing what they should do.
Amen. Are we out of time?
One more?
One more? No. Well, thank you guys so much for everything. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for the invitation.